It's a very interesting update, the latest card tracker. Now we have data up till late September based on about 5 or 6 million weekly transactions across the Westpac system. And it's starting to show a bit of a lift in activity. Now previously we had seen some improvement through particularly late July into August. Part of that was relating to higher fuel prices and part of that was relating to the Matildas. But now it looks to be coming through on a broader base and is looking a little bit more convincing. So it's starting to show a slightly better tone, still not off to the races by any means, but we are seeing some slight signs of improvement starting to show through in the consumer space, which I think is interesting at this point. Look, there's a lot of things in the mix here. I think, aside from those effects from higher fuel prices directly on the dollar spend on petrol and hospitality-related spend from the FIFA World Cup, there's gains across the wider discretionary services space, and that's definitely where we're seeing more positive growth. Aside from that, it's more about a slower pace of contraction around discretionary goods. The previous 12 months, we'd seen some pretty significant declines in household discretionary goods spend, durables, sort of housing-related spending, vehicle-related spending were all in contraction. That contraction looks to have eased off. We might be starting to see a stabilisation. Household goods tend to be those big-ticket items where people cut back or they postpone purchases if they're worried about their family finances. And as we know from our consumer sentiment survey, consumers have been deeply worried about their family finances over the last 12 months. So that looks to be the main channel through which higher inflation and higher interest rates look to be impacting. Discretionary services can be a bit more opportunistic. It can be a sort of more of a small ticket discretionary spend, maybe a sign that households are starting to come out of their shells. I think we need to bear in mind the timing of this. The end of September, it's 15 weeks since the last RBA rate hike. And so consumers, at least the 70% that have variable rate mortgages, or in the third that are mortgage belt consumers, they've stopped being hit by interest rate rises month to month. So some of this looks to be mainly about a stabilisation in the consumer rather than outright growth. I think the other thing to bear in mind is that we've still got quite strong price inflation outside of that fuel space, and we've got strong population growth, which is sort of lifting the base. When we look at the pace that we're seeing around card activity, growth is maybe tracking towards a 1.5% to 2% a quarter gain in the September quarter. So that's decent positive, but once you strip out inflation, it's maybe 1% adjusting for inflation. Once you strip out population growth, it's still in the maybe about 0.5 for the quarter. So it's a more positive tone, but not off to the races. I think it really highlights that we need to watch the space pretty closely. We were a bit wrong-footed by the initial lift, which was mainly around fuel and these event spends. What's showing through now is a bit more consistent, broad-based, and a bit more convincing. If we were to see things accelerate from here, that's a bit of a shift in view for us. At the moment, it's consistent with our view of some improvement, but certainly an interesting update. Well, the other really interesting aspect of the latest updates is that we're seeing a widening divergence across the states. Now, up until now, states have generally sort of followed pretty much the same paths, outside of that COVID period where we had independent lockdowns going on. But since about June this year, we've seen quite a widening at the outperforming end of the spectrum. New South Wales has seen a more pronounced acceleration in spending activity. At the other end of the spectrum, Victoria is now starting to see quite sizable contractions in card activity. And the other surprising aspect of that is that those two states are really at the epicentre of the population growth resurgence. So when we look in per capita terms, the New South Wales gains are not quite as strong, but the weakness we're starting to see in Victoria is quite alarming. Now, we'll be digging into that in more details. Definitely warrants further investigation, but we are seeing a much more varied performance state to state. Amongst the other states, again, Western Australia has been relatively untouched by this slowdown at all. Queensland is seeing a more sort of moderate cycle than the others, but the real standouts are those big two eastern states, which are going in quite different directions at the moment. I think this is really intriguing and an interesting update from our card tracker, and it definitely warrants close attention in the next few weeks to see how well it sustains into October. And then the sort of silly season, the high season of sales leading into Christmas, obviously very important. We are still getting quite mixed messages out of the consumer. On the one hand, consumer sentiment is still really weak. and pointing to per capita spending declines. At the same time, the most recent retail sales updates from the ABS for the month of August are still quite insipid. We're not seeing signs of a pickup showing through in those measures just yet. And we know that within this mix we've got, on the one hand, a very weak sentiment picture, income pressures, inflation, interest rate pressures. On the other hand, very strong population growth, which is something that the consumer sentiment survey measures are not picking up. And of course we've got this price effect in the mix as well. So there's quite a few moving parts here, and we are getting these mixed messages, but I think it's important to pay attention to the lead indicators here, which are well ahead of the official data, are definitely showing there's some signs of improvement coming through with spending.